Good evening. Good evening. I'm John Miko, president of Founding Forward. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Library Hour. As you all know, Founding Forward is the nonprofit charity that's affiliated with the Union League of Philadelphia. And I want to take just a brief moment to thank all of you who give so generously and make possible the work that we do. Thank you for your contributions that make possible an immersive civic education experience for teachers and students from across the country who come to Valley Forge, to Philadelphia, to Lafayette Hill, for incredible experiences about our founding, about our history, about those two great liberty documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, and about their responsibility to make this union more perfect. Thank you for that. Thank you for your contributions that make our scholarship programs possible for dozens of students each year. Thank you for your contributions that make possible the care and expansion of our great art collection and archival collection, including the wonderful equestrian of Thomas Sully, and allow for others to experience it as well. We have pieces that are on loan to organizations throughout Philadelphia and the country, and they're shared with many thousands, maybe millions over the course of time of our fellow citizens. Thank you for making all of that possible, and thank you for making tonight possible. Tonight's program is a speaker program, an educational program of Founding Forward, and I thank you. If you are a donor, I thank you for making it possible. And if you're not a donor, and most of you aren't, about 60% of the people in this room are not contributors to Founding Forward. So that means if you're not a donor, that the person to your left or right probably is. Turn to that person and thank them. They made this possible. Better yet, you'll receive an email tomorrow, and it will ask you to support our work. And our work, thank you. Yes, thank you. And our work is all about making better citizen leaders, and we need that desperately, and we rely on your support. So thank you in advance for that support. So tonight's program, a few housekeeping items. We will have Q&A. We will do that via microphone, so please use the microphone. We are streaming. We want to hear that question. Of course, as always, keep that question short, just a few sentences, and if you can't put a question mark at the end of the sentence, you have failed. So keep it concise if you can, please. A few upcoming programs. We have three really great programs. On April 22nd, a public affairs program, Military Leadership in the 21st Century with General Frank McKenzie. On May 1st, Cyber Threats and National Security with Adam Siegel and Glenn Gerstle, moderated by Stephen Long. And then on May 6th, we have a program on our Valley Forge campus, and I hope you can come out to Valley Forge, our beautiful campus where our student programming is, where our Medal of Honor Grove is. It's really beautiful and inspiring, and it's the legacy of JFK with Dr. Stephen Knott. So we hope you can join us for that. And with no further ado, I want to introduce one of those great citizen leaders, one of those great Union League leaders who, through his generosity, his hard work, and his dedication to our mission makes a lot of what happens possible, especially these speaker programs. The chair of our speaker program, Paul Snitzer, who will introduce the program. Thank you.
Peter Conn retired from the University of Pennsylvania as Vartan Gregorian Professor of English and Professor of Education, and taught graduate courses in History of Art and American Civilization. A John Simon Guggenheim Foundation Fellow, he was also the recipient of an NEH Humanities Focus Grant. He has received several awards for distinguished teaching and taught and lectured throughout China on American studies. Conn has served as literary consultant on numerous television projects, including the Emmy Award-winning series, The American Short Story. He serves as principal literary advisor to Oprah's book club for The Good Earth. From 2016 to 19, Conn was the executive director of the Athenaeum of Philadelphia. His latest book about artist Thomas Sully, Union League member and painter of the George Washington masterwork that sits atop of the Broad Street Stairs is titled Thomas Sully's Philadelphians, Painting the Athens of America. Founding Forward is honored to welcome Professor Peter Conn.
My thanks to the Union League and Founding Forward for the invitation. My thanks to all of you for coming. This is the commercial, of course, and that'll disappear fairly quickly. And despite the location of my name on that portrait, that is Thomas Sully. That's not me, even at my best and youngest. Let me explain a little bit about how I'd like to proceed. Most of you at least, I hope there were almost enough to go around, have received a handout. And the purpose of the handout, aside from, again, encouraging you to buy a book on the way out, is slightly more serious. In the time allotted, I will be able to cover just a little bit of what's going on in this book, and I'll explain that little bit in just a second. But I want you to have at least some record of the scope of the book. And so the table of contents is there not so much as a roadmap to what I'm going to say, I'll explain that as I go, but just to exemplify the fact or confirm the fact that the book covers a wide range of institutions, individuals, themes, and so on. They told me I need to use this. That's great. I start with this image, which I suspect nobody in the room has seen because it is located behind a locked door in the archives of the Franklin Institute. I show it for several reasons. One, because it's an extraordinary demonstration of Sully's skill. Beyond the ordinary, as it were, the conventional portraits, many of which you will see tonight. If I didn't tell you that that was a portrait, I think you'd have some trouble not realizing that it wasn't a cameo. His command of that three-dimensional space is quite remarkable. I also begin with Benjamin Franklin because he was responsible for a good many of the institutions that I talk about in this book. And he is also the author of the subtitle of the book, Painting the Athens of America. Many of you have heard that phrase, I'm sure, Philadelphia describing itself or being described as the Athens of America. It's often associated with the painter Gilbert Stuart. It actually occurred first in a letter from Benjamin Franklin to the colonial governor in 1735, before all of the institutions that actually made Philadelphia the Athens of America existed. So, before I turn to the images and stories that are in my book, I am delighted to be able to pay tribute to the gigantic and really quite extraordinary Sully here at the Union League of George Washington. There's a long story that goes into this 1842 portrait, obviously therefore not from life, as Ben Franklin was not. But it seems to me, as I spent time in front of it over the last couple of weeks, to have been a portrait that I suspect Washington would have preferred. This is not Washington on the Mount Rushmore Monument. This is Washington in action. Washington the leader. Washington on his horse. He was reputed to have been the best horseman in the colonies and later in the early United States. And it's a romantic portrait. That cloudy and both threatening and promising sky behind him, and above all, the way that cape is swirling around. He's moving, he's alive, he's in charge. And now we're going to talk a little bit about, let's go back. Talk a little bit about Thomas Sully. Sully was born in 1783 in Lincolnshire in England. His theatrical family moved to Richmond, Virginia, emigrated to what was by now or just about to be the U.S. in 1795. He grew up there and then in Hartford, but by the time he was an adult and was already embarked on his very long painterly career, he had settled in Philadelphia. Sully lived to be just about 90 years old and had a career, all of it in Philadelphia, of about 70 years, in the course of which he produced 2,000 portraits, a number I will return to a little while. There is some evidence that Sully might have preferred to have become a historical painter, painter of history. And that example of the Washington portrait indicates that he would have been pretty good at it. However, this was America. This wasn't Europe. In Europe, historical painting in those years, and indeed in the years before and for some years after, historical painting was the prestige genre, and it fetched the highest prices. Not in America. In America, it was going to be portraits. In 1805, Aaron Burr, wrote to John Vanderlyn, a distinguished American artist who was then studying in Paris. And Burr said, "You've got to come home. Quote, if you are to send in some portrait painting, this is the best country, for here is the rage for portraits." 2 years later, a humor magazine reported, "Everyone is anxious to see his face on canvas, however stupid or ugly it may be." And the painter Charles Neal wrote that portraits, quote, abounded in our country. "You can hardly open the door of the best room anywhere without surprising or being surprised by a picture of somebody plastered to the wall and staring at you with both eyes and a bunch of flowers." So in America, it was going to be portraits, and Sully was going to become a master. So at that point, let's pause for just a moment to talk about the city in which Sully was living in the early part of the 19th and into the middle part of the 19th century. From its founding in the 17th century, Philadelphia was based on commerce, on trade. By the middle of the 18th century, the merchants were doing business, and a big business, bigger than New York up to that time and into the early 19th century, across the Atlantic, the Gulf ports, buying and selling, importing, exporting. In 1800, a ship from Philadelphia became the first to make it all the way to China. I still, to this day, don't quite know how they did it, but they did it. As of about 1800, as you know, Philadelphia began to lose some of the centrality that had marked its career to that date. Specifically, politics at that time is moving from here to Washington, D.C. Prior to that, this was the center of politics. Finance is beginning to move to New York. It hasn't completed that transition, but it is going on. However, Philadelphia remained the center of law, medicine, science, music, and publishing. It was the most cosmopolitan city in America. And Franklin's dream of Philadelphia as the Athens of America had more or less come to fruition. There was some justice in that phrase. At the same time, and we're going to talk about this later, it was also a city of frequent murderous violence, and we're going to experience some of that as we go forward. So, what I plan to do is survey 3 chapters out of the many in a little bit of detail, and then just show you some additional of the good portraits and just a comment or two on them in order to stay within the ground rules. So the first of these, he said, consulting his material, is a chapter on theater. Theater in Philadelphia has an interesting and checkered history. It would emerge as one of the most important theatrical centers in the country in the very early 19th century. But at the opening, say by 1776, in the latter part of the 18th century, opposition to theaters, led primarily by Quakers, had kept the theater restricted to the fringes. Following in 1759, the House of Representatives of the colony passed a law, quote, forbidding the showing and acting of plays with a penalty of 500 pounds. The First Continental Congress, meeting in Philadelphia in 1774, passed a resolution denouncing, quote, every species of extravagance and dissipation, especially all horse racing and all kinds of gambling, cockfighting, exhibition of shows and plays, and other expensive diversions. Young Jacob Ehrensoller, the first apprentice at Pennsylvania Hospital, signed his apprenticeship in 1773, which, along with prohibitions against dice playing and fornication, was told that he was not to, quote, haunt alehouses, taverns, or playhouses. So there wasn't much going on in the theater here until Washington was inaugurated and began to serve here as president, because Washington loved the theater. And so the theater became possible. And what I'm going to show you is one of the more famous of those theaters, and they began to abound. This is the Second Chestnut Street Theater, designed by Strickland in, by this time, about 1822. Sat 2,000 people, galleries up above, pit down below, and the question is, and it was hugely successful. Remember, back in the early 19th century, aside from the sermons that you might enjoy on Sunday and the kind of frivolity you might have in a tavern, theaters were where you got your principal entertainment. And by the early 19th century, the prices made it available to most people, not necessarily the best seats, but getting in and seeing them. What did Philadelphians go to see? We happen to have a lot of information about that. Shakespeare was at that point already the guy, and 1/4 of all the plays put on in most of these playhouses in the early 19th century were Shakespeare. Romeo and Juliet and Richard III. So, how to illustrate this history of the theater? This extraordinary portrait is of a man named George Frederick Cook. You'll see the name again if you take a look at the chapter on theater in the table of contents. Cook was an extraordinarily successful English actor, and his specialty was Richard III. From the time he premiered it in the early 19th century, he was a star. And the problem was that he was also a drunk. And so he was frequently absent from the posted performances of his plays, and the managers were repeatedly putting up a sign, indisposition, the star is indisposed. He agreed to come to the United States late in his career, and a lot of people on this side of the Atlantic remember this is a time when Americans are feeling politically superior to the old world, but culturally inferior. And so even here in Philadelphia, a lot of people were saying, why would somebody of his stature cross the Atlantic, a dangerous journey, to come to this wilderness and perform? And the story, semi-confirmed, is that he was so angry with his manager in London and drunk that he signed the contract, and over he came. And he was a spectacular success. And his famous role was Richard III. So what Sully has done here in 1810, at the request of a set of Cook fans, is to have represented Richard III at his most villainous. This is a man who, in Sully's construction of him, was a villain who was proud of his villainy. Everything about this painting, which is in PAFA, by the way, except that it's in storage, so you may not have seen it, is a masterwork. All the surfaces, from the granite to the leather to the fabric on that spectacular garment he's wearing, and to the way in which he's got a half smile on his evil, self-satisfied face. I can smile, he says, and smile and murder as I smile. The plume on his head arches backward toward a figure that may be hard to see from wherever you are, but it's a statue of a female saint. And what it's doing is emphasizing just what a self-satisfied evil guy this is by insulting the place in which he's making this soliloquy, a church. He's inside a church discussing with us in the audience just what a foul person he is. And it's a wonderful portrait, almost life-size, not quite life-size. Sully was 28 years old when he produced this, as I say, on commission from fans of Cook. He charged $300 for it. They accepted the deal. And in his journal, which I've read through, for years after that, he kept complaining that they hadn't come across with the $300, which is too bad. The next person we look at is more familiar today than George Frederick Cook, Fanny Kemble. Fanny Kemble, English actress, obviously, was part of the Kemble dynasty, theatrical dynasty, but had no interest in going on stage. Her father, Charles, was in trouble with his theater in Covent Garden in London, and he pleaded with Fanny, please, help out here, play Juliet. On 3 weeks' notice, she did. And the responses to her were astounding. The audience hailed this girl of 19 rapturously and as the worthy successor to her incomparable aunt, and that was Sarah Siddons, one of the greatest actresses on the London stage in the 19th century. She came to the United States 2 years later with her father because by then, following Cook back in 1810, the first big star to come, lots of British actors of significance were coming here because they were making quite a lot of money. So we have quite a few records of the way the audiences responded to her. In a play that we no longer much see called Fazio, one critic wrote, when she rose with the action of the play and began to display her power, when she gave to the fierce passions of the role the agonized threats of the half-maddened wife, the spectators were transported with enthusiasm and wept and applauded wildly by turns. And I have a lot more of that. But we're with Fanny Kemble for a couple of reasons, beyond the extraordinary success she had. We're here partly for this portrait. Sully became friends not just with Fanny Kemble, but with the whole Kemble family. And in fact, the whole Sully family became friends with the whole Kemble family. And in the course of a few years, Sully painted 18 different portraits of Fanny Kemble. This is regarded as the best. It's Fanny Kemble as Beatrice in Much Ado About Nothing. The portrait itself is extraordinary. She seems to rise out of billows of pink and gray. Her face is brought into sharp focus by the dark and then darker background behind her. She turns to face the viewer, her face framed by, excuse me, once again, faced by ringlets and her hair parted in the middle. Her gaze is steady, appraising, a declaration of her confidence. Sully himself valued the painting highly, and in a story I won't tell tonight, he went over in 1837 to London to paint Queen Victoria, and he brought that painting with him as evidence of his skill, and the Queen agreed. And Sully, therefore, is the person who painted the first full-length portrait of Queen Victoria just after she had become queen and even before her coronation. But we're also here for this. Fanny Kemble married Pierce Butler, a Georgia plantation owner and slaveholder. He had pursued her, you might say stalked her, throughout her brief, it turned out to be 5-year career on the stage. He would show up in her dressing room, sometime playing a flute, and she was sufficiently disengaged with the theater that she had been so successful in that she finally said, why not? And she married him. They moved to Virginia. She was almost instantly so horrified by what she found about the reality. She wrote this book, A Residence on a Georgia Plantation from 1838 to 1839. She just walked out and eventually divorced him. But if you are able to see it, and if you're not, I'll read it. It says publication date is 1863. She wrote it but didn't publish it in 1838-39. And I have a footnote in this section on Fanny Kemble that explains why As early as 1835, Kemble had written an anti-slavery article. Writing to a friend from Philadelphia, she said that she had not dared to publish it, quote, lest our fellow citizens should tear our house down, make a bonfire of our furniture, a favorite mode of remonstrance in these parts with those who advocate the rights of the unhappy blacks. So she kept it in a drawer out of fear for the kind of violence I'll be describing in about 15 minutes, and only published it in 1863, immediately upon Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. She was still a big deal in England by reputation, even though she hadn't been on the English stage in decades. And there's an entire scholarship that suggests that book, published in London, had something to do with ameliorating the hostility that many English politicians were feeling toward the North at that moment. So she may even have made a political intervention. Great actress and also a fine political person. The next section, the Jews of Philadelphia. The image on the screen is Mikveh Israel, 1782, according to at least a couple of sources, perhaps the first synagogue in the city, something like 4th and Cherry. I start with Alexis de Tocqueville, who famously came to the US in 1831 to study prisons, but within 5 years after he'd gone back, published the landmark, never out of print, always consulted Democracy in America. And I am going to read you just a couple of sentences from one of the chapters, beginning of one of the chapters, where he says, upon my arrival in the United States, the religious aspect of the country was the first thing that struck my attention. I paraphrase now. In France, we all felt that religion and freedom were contradictory. He said, aha, in America, I found they were intimately united and that they reigned in common over the country. For the Americans, the idea of Christianity and liberty are so completely mingled that it is almost impossible to get them conceive of the one without the other. Well, a couple of scholars have pursued his insight. From its colonial beginnings, America regarded itself as a Christian polity. A scholar has surveyed the charters of the original 13 colonies, that many of them employed a Christian vocabulary, included the promotion of Christianity as a primary aim, enacted blasphemy laws, enacted laws that prevented non-Christians from performing religious services, and it goes on. It goes on. Christianity and the separation of church and state, let's put it that way, was nowhere to be found in early America. At the time that Sully is in Philadelphia and beginning to paint one of the people you're going to see, it was embroiled in what was called the Second Great Awakening, an evangelical revival. It was sweeping across New England and much of the mid-Atlantic states. That evangelical revival, of course, posed a threat to the Jews. The population of Jews in Philadelphia in these years was minuscule. It was a few hundred out of quite a few thousand. And they were rarely the subject of physical abuse, but they were always aware of their marginality. And that would be particularly true when a revision of the colonial charter, which had once just said religiously, you had to affirm your belief in the Creator, substituted for that, over Franklin's objection, you have to affirm both the Old and the New Testaments. And it was clearly aimed, above all, at the city's Jews. At the same time, many of those Jews flourished. And the Gratz family were the principal figures in that success. And there was success. Jews found themselves, or were able to find themselves on the boards of some of the major organizations, including, for example, the Athenaeum and the Library Company. As early as 1760, the college that would become the University of Pennsylvania was admitting young Jewish men. So it was not an unadulterated campaign of bigotry or prejudice, although again, it was always impossible to escape the fact that you were marginal and that you were being targeted by conversion activities. A humorous magazine at that time published this statement: over the last 5 years, the evangelicals have spent $500,000 converting 5 Jews. Now, it's actually not funny because it was part of a campaign of intimidation and so on, and being supported by the press and being supported by certain preachers in the city, but it does indicate that it wasn't having the kind of effect that we'll talk about with black people in a little while. So the person with whom I'm going to illustrate this piece of our history is, of course, Rebecca Gratz. The most famous Jewish woman of the 19th century in Philadelphia, and probably the most famous Jewish person. She was an avid reader. She was not just of Jewish devotional texts. Her household included Hume's History of England, the collected works of Shakespeare, even Milton's Paradise Lost, and she read and approved of Walter Scott's Ivanhoe. If you are at all familiar with that, you will know that one of the principal characters is a Jewish woman, Rebecca. And she wrote to a friend about having read Ivanhoe. I felt a little extra pleasure from Rebecca's being a Hebrew maiden. I feel gratitude for Scott's justification of the Jewish character. There's an urban legend that, in fact, Rebecca of York in Ivanhoe was based on Rebecca Gratz. That's probably not true, but scholars have said that the presentation of Rebecca in Ivanhoe is probably the most sympathetic depiction of a Jewish character in 19th century English language literature. Gratz's significance lies primarily in all the work she did of a humanitarian sort: orphanages, foster homes, philanthropies to support women and children after their husband dies and there's no other means of support. In all of these activities, she was demonstrating a capacity for organization, for leadership and administration, and succeeding. She never married, but I'll comment on that in just a second. Thomas Sully didn't know it, but Rebecca Gratz had heard about him before he heard about her. When he was on his way to move into Philadelphia permanently, Washington Irving, who was a friend of Rebecca Gratz, wrote and said, "A young man named Sully is coming to Philadelphia. I hope you will make him feel at home." Sully painted 2 portraits of Gratz. This one, as one scholar has written, Gratz is a glowing, stylish, and lovely woman with a clear sense of self-command and undeterred by the proverbial condescending designation, spinster. In this portrait, Sully captures her social persona as she directly and graciously greets the viewer. The other portrait that Sully painted of Rebecca Gratz came a little bit later, and it's this one. And I wish that would stop doing that. In any case, this one is also important. This is also important because here, this romantically clouded background, just a patch of blue along the side of her neck. Glistening dark hair, topped by a splendid hat, almost provocatively heart-shaped. She emerges out of her elegant costume looking past us, content with her own thoughts, and a reminder that the earnest and hard-working Gratz was also a social and sociable woman, a fine conversationalist, a frequent theatergoer. She often went to Fanny Kemble's performances and became friends with Kemble, a fashionably dressed guest at dinner parties and musical Productions. And from that, we go to the third and last of these this is the ongoing and fierce debate over slavery in antebellum Philadelphia, 13th chapter of the book. In the late 18th and early 19th century, Philadelphia had the largest population of black people, both free and enslaved, in the United States. Demographic historians say that by about the time of the American Revolution, there were probably 250 free black people in Philadelphia and 1,400 enslaved black people in Philadelphia. Pennsylvania is proud of claiming that it passed the first abolition law in the United States. It's all true, but there's an asterisk. It was the Gradual Emancipation Act, and it was sufficiently complicated that people were still in slavery in Philadelphia in the 1830s. In any case, in part because of Quaker influence, Philadelphia was also the scene of the first protests against slavery. As some of you may know, Francis Pastorius, a Quaker, in the 17th century, about 1680s, published the first manifesto condemning slavery and demanding abolition. Because of its location and because of its black population, it was also the site of the foundation of most of the first and eventually most of the abolition societies in the country, and became, in the words of one scholar, the world capital of abolition. It included such organizations as the American Anti-Slavery Female Society, which was the first integrated abolition society. But although abolition attracted a large number of adherents, supporters, contributors, it actually also provoked counter-violence. And it was counter-violence on an increasing scale through the first half of the 19th century. 18th century white tolerance, and there had been a good deal of that, and this is W.E.B. Du Bois's estimate, was being replaced by 19th century hostility. And in Philadelphia, it was tremendously divided over this question. Remember that this is the southernmost northern city. There were all sorts of family connections linking Philadelphians to relatives in the South. Perhaps more than that, a lot of Philadelphia manufacturing, especially in textiles, was utterly dependent on the cotton being grown in the South. And as that early 18th century, the period we're talking about, as that early 18th century moved forward, one scholar has written, 6 large-scale race riots targeted black people between 1829 and 1854. I want to put a verbal footnote in here. Because of my focus in this chapter on the issue of slavery, I have just reported to you, and will report a little more, on what was happening to Philadelphia's black people. I could have also added Philadelphia's white people who would get together to terrorize blacks. The Protestant white people would then go beat up on the Catholic white people, as you know, tremendous violence in that direction. Areas of the city were controlled by armed mobs who, like mafiosi, would simply intimidate people in their neighborhood and extort from them. Labor violence was endemic, especially during times post-1819 and post-1832 of economic slump. Even politics. In 1834, 2 years after Andrew Jackson had crushed the second bank of the United States, a story I tell in one of the chapters of the book, in 1834, there was a riot in which pro-bank people were bloodily attacking anti-bank people in the streets of Philadelphia. It was a violent and consistently violent city. The worst moment probably for black rights and black citizenship in Philadelphia in the early 18th century came in 1838. In that year, two things happened. First, the state legislature, the Commonwealth legislature, revised the Constitution of the Commonwealth and inserted the word white in front of voting requirements. And in that same year, in 1838, the Fortin family, whom some of you are familiar with, a wealthy black family, very active in abolition and other causes, raised the money to build a large and handsome building in the middle of Philadelphia called Pennsylvania Hall. It was built specifically for the purpose of holding abolition meetings. And several thousand abolitionists from all over the East Coast had gathered in Philadelphia in their various hotels and boarding houses and friends' bedrooms and so on to attend the first meeting. And hundreds of them marched into Pennsylvania Hall 3 days after it opened. Within hours, a mob of white men came and burned the place to the ground. Nobody died. People got out, thank goodness. But it was an indication of just how bad it could be. Well, there is a hero in this story, and this is him, William Henry Furness. William Henry Furness, who was a childhood friend and classmate of Ralph Waldo Emerson, a friendship that continued mostly by letter throughout the rest of their long lives, and it is a great privilege to sit and read the letters between William Henry Furness and Ralph Waldo Emerson. He became the first minister of Philadelphia's first Unitarian church in 1825 at a young age. He would serve as that Unitarian minister for 50 years until 1875, and then as senior minister until his death in 1893. From the beginning, he preached against slavery. But he preached so, if you can imagine what I'm trying to get at here, with a certain amount of moderation. He could understand arguments on both sides. He himself preferred this over that. We wish we didn't have slavery, etc. In 1839, and I am convinced it was at least in part in response to that image you just saw of the burning of Pennsylvania Hall, which he was watching happen. From 1839 forward, he became a tireless, eloquent advocate for abolition. And in this city, at that time, it was very brave. But he did it. He did it week after week, month after month. He lost congregants, but he gained congregants. He was further outraged by the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which, as you know, at that point, legally required northern citizens and officials to aid in the recapture of runaway slaves. And Furness was not the only person outraged by this, but he was. Indeed, and preached so violently against it in his Sunday sermons that on good authority we know that President John Buchanan, Pennsylvania's only president, President John Buchanan met with his cabinet to look into the possibility of indicting Furness for treason. It didn't happen, but I think Furness might have welcomed it. This portrait by Sully, I think is quite wonderful. This one is in a private collection. A strong, serious, confident man, painted in his younger days, obviously. And it's not he's a good-looking man, but no flattery has necessarily occurred. Furness's biographer said he was a handsome man, large in stature, graceful in bearing, wonderfully winning smile, which you can only see the beginning of here. As with a lot of Sully's portraits, he commands you on how to look at this. That hand that's rendered so beautifully, with its upturned fingers pointing up through the V of that shirt to that handsome face. And it's as if he's in the middle of a conversation, which he often was. Furness was a big talker. All right. Now, having done all that, yeah, I'm not doing too badly. What I'm going to do from here is just a few more of the good portraits with a couple of sentences identifying who they are and why they're in this book. So, for example, this one, which is one of my favorites, it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art, so some of you may recognize it. It's a big, big painting. This is Colonel Jonathan Williams. Despite the blue, he's an Army officer, and a distinguished one. He was the grandnephew of Benjamin Franklin, and early in his life had served as one of Franklin's secretaries in Paris. He went off to a military career that included being named by Thomas Jefferson as the first commandant of the newly founded West Point Military Academy, and then being named the first head of the Army Corps of Engineers. This is Williams in Philadelphia, to which he had returned late in his life after he had retired. In the background is, through, again, romantic haze, Sully liked to do that kind of thing, is a structure called Fort William. He had designed it, and it was named after him. One of the things I love about this particular portrait, which you will have some trouble seeing, I think, in this slide from that distance, is that about, you count buttons up, 1, 2, 3, 4 from his sash, one of the buttons is unbuttoned. And I just simply am attracted to that. He's an old soldier. He doesn't have to stand inspection anymore. He's quite content to sit there in all of his fleshy rotundity and look at you with those very piercing blue eyes. This one is an interesting, this is at, come on, this one is at Princeton. This is George Mifflin Dallas. Now, George Mifflin Dallas may be the most significant political figure in Philadelphia history, which is to say, he became vice president of the United States under Polk. He had, of course, aspired to the presidency and didn't get there. This is Dallas at the age of about 18, graduating summa cum laude from Princeton University. And Sully has gone to extraordinary lengths to emphasize this guy's very handsome face. And by the way, again, no flattery, because we have photographs of him later, and it looks like this guy a little older. The same device of a dark background, in this case, however, lightened by what is almost a halo around his head to push his face even more forward, and a look on his face of confidence, possibly even edging toward arrogance. And it would be true of him throughout his career. George Mifflin Dallas has only one biography of George Mifflin Dallas. It's fairly slender. And the author of it says, well, he didn't do much. And, you know, many books, especially nonfiction, will open with a little inscription of some kind. This book, the biography of George Mifflin Dallas, opens with a tiny story. 2 brothers left home to seek their fortune. One went to sea and one became vice president. Neither was ever heard from again. So that is George Mifflin Dallas. The next 2, and I'm just about at the end here, are from Pennsylvania Hospital. This is a man named Samuel Coates, who was one of the managers of the hospital back in the late 18th and very early 19th century. It is almost life-size. It hangs where it has been hanging since 1810 in the old part of the Pennsylvania Hospital, and it's a masterpiece. Once again, as with that opening portrait of George Frederick Cook, every surface is spectacular. His clothing, his Quaker clothing, as you can see, the turkey coppet at his feet, the leather on his shoes, the light coming in through the window, the way everything is directed toward him, the quill on his pen. He's writing on a stack of papers, and if you get up close to this painting, Sully somehow miraculously makes you think you're seeing a stack of papers. I don't even, as I look at it constantly, I work at Pennsylvania Hospital. Anyway, I can't even figure it out. And above all, it's the look on his face. He's looking right at you. So every time you encounter this painting, you're in a direct and dramatic conversation with Samuel Coates. The other Sully that is also in Pennsylvania Hospital is far more famous. This, of course, is Benjamin Rush. And Rush has had 7 full-length biographies. Rush was the undoubtedly most celebrated, and also because of 1793 and yellow fever, which everybody knows about or asked me about, the most controversial physician in America. He was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, close friends with both Jefferson and Adams, both when they were divided and when they came together. And this is the photograph or a copy of the painting that appears on virtually the cover of every book ever written about Benjamin Rush. This painting is dramatic in a different way than the Samuel Coates. He's not looking at you. Rush is not looking at you, nor is he looking at whatever it is he's reading. And Sully was really good with something that's really hard. If any of you have studied drawing, hands. He was terrific at hands. So there's Rush holding open this document, which may be something he was writing. He wrote all the time. Looking neither at that nor at us. What is he doing? He's thinking. And a mutual friend of these two, a doctor named David Hosack, wrote to Rush and said, Rush, have Sully do your portrait. He will not only get your outside, he will get your mind. And it's the portrait of a man thinking. And finally, this one, the last one. This is John Vaughan. John Vaughan was the secretary of and librarian of the American Philosophical Society for over 40 years. He was a wine merchant who lived in the American Philosophical Society building and stored his wines in the basement. Washington was a friend, came to dinner from time to time in the Philadelphia years, and made Vaughan his exclusive wine merchant. This painting, which is in the American Philosophical Society of John Vaughan, is, in my view, another extraordinarily handsome painting. He's quite appropriately, as a librarian for all those years, who's given credit for sorting out what was a chaotic collection, big book over on the left with, once again, his hand holding his own place in what he's reading and looking off to his left, not at us, simply thinking about what he's reading. And that, ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, I'd be delighted to talk.
Professor Conn, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. We have time for a couple of questions. Peter, right here, yes.
Many years ago, Mary and I were invited to the ambassador's house in London, the United States ambassador to Great Britain. As we walked toward the reception area, we were astounded to see another Thomas Sully picture of George Washington, every bit as big as the one that we have upstairs.
Yeah.
And George Washington was on a horse.
Yeah.
I seem to recall that there were no cannons in the background, but nonetheless, it was, other than that, virtually the same GW as we have upstairs.
Yeah.
The ambassador was not aware of the fact that there was one in Philadelphia, and he called his person over to explain to us that, yes, Thomas Sully did that one as well, but he didn't have any details. Can you help us, Professor?
Pardon?
Do you know anything about that portrait in London?
The portrait in London?
Yes, sir.
Nothing. I know nothing about that portrait. But I will add that I had mentioned that was the one here, the one we took a look at, and all of you are familiar with, and that I think is spectacular. That he had originally, I think, intended to be a historical painter, which he soon learned was a problem. Part of the reason it was a problem is we didn't have much history at that time. We had the Revolution, but Jonathan Trumbull had taken care of that. He occupied that whole space. And so there is yet another Washington by Sully, bigger than these two that you've just referred to, including this one here, called Washington's Passage of the Delaware. It's not as tall as the one here, but it's much wider. And while it is unknown, and Emanuel Leutz's at the Metropolitan is very famous, Sully's is far better than Emanuel Leutz's, which, as you recall, is an idiotically nonsensical Washington standing up in a barge being rowed across a tumultuous winter river, whereas Sully's is another version of Washington on his horse, having crossed the Delaware and now climbing up the bank. And the same kind of energy and the same kind of romantic, things are moving and so on. So he could do it, but it wasn't where the money was. And by the way, he had 12 children. So he had to be thinking all the time about what he could sell, and he worked in a hurry. Remember I said 2,000 portraits? We know it's 2,000 because Sully may not be the only painter who ever did this, but the only one I know of. He kept a meticulous record of every painting he ever painted. And so we know how many and we know who they were, and we know when he painted them, and we know the sizes of them, and we know the prices he charged for them. And he was a businessman, let's put it that way. He kept his eye on the bottom line, as well as painting beautifully. He had a family to support.
Peter.
How did Thomas Sully learn about the personalities of his subjects? Did he spend time living with them? How did he capture
once
all
again,
that we
I'm
saw?
not hearing.
Wondering about the personalities of the subjects. Did he get to know the subjects? And if so, how did he get to know them?
Well, that's a complicated question. There is no full-length biography of Thomas Sully. And the reason there isn't is there isn't enough material. We know everything about Thomas Sully's professional life, including every single painting he painted. And he was prominent enough that his toing and froing, his coming and going, was covered in the local papers. Or if he went to New York, there might be a paragraph about him in the New York papers because he was so prominent. He was so prominent, he was commissioned to paint portraits of sitting and ex-presidents, Monroe, Jefferson. The Jackson on the $20 bill is a Sully Jackson. But what we don't know, because there's no letters, there's no table talk, there is a diary or a journal, but it's all professional, sold this painting to Mr. Jones today for $30. And, I've spent hours and hours reading through everything I can find that Sully actually left behind, and it's not. So in answer to your question, very briefly, he knew a lot about some of these folks because they were his neighbors and friends. He didn't know anything about a lot of them because he was just looking for business, and he would set up his easel, and somebody would come in, and he would do the portrait. And he would, according to the dates, at least in his register, which is where all this information is, he could complete an ordinary sort of half-length portrait in 2 weeks. So sitter would come in once or twice, Sully would make the sketches, and then he'd just do it. And by the time he's 90 years old, there's 2,000 of them. One thing I want to say about that is, anybody who writes about Sully's paintings, about his work, about his quality, has to acknowledge that he or she has not seen hardly any of them. Because of those 2,000, I don't think that there are more than about 400 that I could easily identify the location of and might get a chance to see if I traveled. And it's interesting, this is the third talk I've given on this book. I am now getting emails from people all over Philadelphia with images of their Sully paintings. Honest to goodness. And that's exactly what I was hypothesizing was, of course, that many stayed in the families for whom they were painted a couple of hundred years ago. But not thousands, but nonetheless, they're turning up. And people are saying, would you come and look at my Sully? And I'm going to go look at some more Sullys. But that's the best I can do with that question.
Well, one more question over here, yes.
Well, clearly Sully knew a lot about himself.
I'm sorry.
So in his self-portraiture, what do you think he was trying to convey about himself?
What do you think Sully was trying to portray about himself in his self-portrait?
Oh my goodness, I think he was trying, in fact, I don't know how to do this. If we could go back to that image, he was portraying himself, I think, in a kind of characteristically romantic mode. The artist. This is when the artist is becoming a romantic figure. This is when, even better without me, without my name right there. I mean, he's looking right at us, and again, confident, alive. His portraits are alive. They're not like, I hate to say it, but the whole Peel family, which gets a lot of attention, and they deserve it. But I look a lot of, except for Rembrandt Peale, who's as good as Sully. So I think what he's trying to show is a young man at the peak of his powers with his brush in his hand, you know, just reminding you what he does for a living, and communicating that to you, communicating his confidence and his talent.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Professor Peter Conn. Professor, thank you so much for a great presentation. We do have a few books that are for sale. I'm sure the professor will be happy to sign them for you. We'll see you next Tuesday at our next program, Military Leadership in the 21st Century. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.